I used to write poems about silence. That's what my editor called my first collection, the Silence Collection, though that wasn't the title I gave it. She said the white space on the page was as important as the words, that I had a gift for what wasn't said. I took it as a compliment at the time. I was 31, newly published, newly convinced that I had found the thing I was put here to do. I didn't understand back then that silence had teeth. I understand it now. The morning it happened, I was supposed to be resting. That was the word the nurses used, resting, as though what was happening to my body was a kind of vacation, something I'd chosen, something I could unchoose when I felt ready. I was not resting. I was sitting in a chair by the window of the hospice on the 15th floor, watching the city below do what it always did, roar. Horns, construction, the flat shriek of brakes on the crosstown bus, someone's music bleeding through a car window 3 stories down. The average noise level in Manhattan hovers around 90 decibels. I know that now because someone told me once, and the number stuck, the kind of fact that seems useless until the day it isn't. 90 decibels, a never-ending scream by any other name. Reuben came in at 9:15 with my medication, and a look on his face that told me he was going to suggest the group outing again. "Sam," he said, "don't. It would do you good, fresh air, a little sun." He set the cup of pills on the table, 3 of them. I could have told you exactly what each one was, what it was supposed to do, what it had failed to prevent. "There's a puppet show in the park. Some of the others want to go." I looked at him. He had the kind of face that was hard to say no to, wide open, no guile in it, the face of a man who had chosen this work and still, somehow, hadn't been ground down by it. I had spent 3 months watching him and I still didn't understand it. Most people, close proximity to dying made them careful, restrained, a little distant. Reuben just kept showing up. "I'll go," I said. He blinked. "To the park, I'll go to the puppet show." I picked up the pills, "but I'm not staying if it's depressing." He laughed, and it was a real laugh, and I remember thinking that was the last normal sound I heard. The last sound that was just a person being happy, for no complicated reason. The bus they had chartered smelled like industrial cleaner and someone's lunch. There were 9 of us from the hospice and 2 nurses. I sat near the back with Frodo on my lap. He was technically my emotional support animal, though he conducted himself more like a senior administrator who had consented to observe, and I watched the city scroll past the window. I had grown up in Harlem. I had left for school, come back, left again, come back again, the way people do when a place has roots in them. The city I was watching through that window was my city, and I was watching it the way you look at something you know you're about to lose. I wasn't thinking about aliens. Nobody was thinking about aliens. The first one came through the clouds like a god, deciding to be done with patience. I didn't see it land. I heard it, felt it rather, a percussion in the sternum that had nothing to do with sound and everything to do with mass. The bus lurched. I grabbed the seat back in front of me, and Frodo dug his claws into my thigh, which was the most communication he'd offered all morning. Through the window, I saw something strike the street 3 blocks north. Not an explosion, not a fireball, just a sudden brutal reorganization of matter. A crater where a moment ago there had been asphalt and a pretzel cart, and whatever else occupied that particular square of city. Then the screaming started. Not just ours, everyone's. The street outside erupted. People running in every direction, the kind of running that bypasses thought, pure animal displacement, bodies trying to put distance between themselves and a danger they couldn't yet name. The bus driver was out of his seat. One of the nurses was on her phone. Reuben was already moving toward me, toward the others, trying to count us. I looked out the window and saw the first one clearly. It was tall. That's the first thing. Not the way a person is tall, with weight distributed sensibly across a frame that evolution has had time to refine. It was tall the way a building is tall, a specific and indifferent verticality, height as a statement of fact about the world rather than a characteristic of a living thing. Its body was armored. Not armor placed on a body, but the armor was the body overlapping plates of something that looked like keratin but moved like it was making decisions, articulating in response to vibration, the way a satellite dish tracks a signal. Its head was angular and flat, and it had no eyes. None. Where eyes would be, there was more of that same plated surface, seamless, indifferent to light. It was moving toward the sound. That was the thing that organized the chaos for me, in that moment when most people were still in the stage of reaction that precedes thought. I watched it move, and I understood. It wasn't hunting with sight. It wasn't hunting with smell. It was using our noise to navigate toward us, the way a bat uses echo, but reversed. It was triangulating on us through every sound we were producing, every scream and footfall and horn blast, and it was walking with absolute certainty through a city that it had arrived in perhaps 90 seconds ago and already owned. 90 decibels. A feeding signal. I grabbed Reuben's sleeve. He looked at me, and I saw in his face that he'd seen it too, that the same math was happening behind his eyes. I didn't speak. I put my finger to my lips. He nodded, pale, but he nodded. I don't know how many survived the first minutes. I know we lost 2 people from our group before we made it half a block from the bus. One of the nurses, who screamed when the creature passed close, and a man named Gerald who had been telling me for 3 weeks that his doctors had given him 6 months, and that he intended to spend 4 of them in Italy. Gerald didn't make it to Italy. I grieved him later. In that moment I was moving. The city went through stages, the way any catastrophe does. The first stage was pure noise, everyone running and screaming and making every mistake simultaneously. The second stage was the moment when enough people understood, when the screaming began to thin, replaced by something worse, a terrified hush, the sound of thousands of people trying to become invisible through sheer will. The third stage was military. Helicopters over the river, the amplified voice of someone in uniform cutting through the still air. Proceed to South Street Seaport. The water is safe. The creatures cannot follow you into the water. Lifeboats are standing by. Proceed silently. Proceed immediately. Reuben touched my arm. South was the seaport. Rescue. Safety, whatever that meant in a world that had, in the last 40 minutes, disclosed its actual character. Reuben was pointing south. I looked north, uptown, Harlem 6 miles away. I had a doctor who told me 18 months ago that I had perhaps 2 years. I had another doctor 3 months ago who revised that downward and said I was already past the original estimate and that I should, gently but firmly, begin making decisions about what I wanted the end to look like. I had made some of those decisions. I had made arrangements. I had said the things to the people who needed to hear them. I had, in the language of the hospice, accepted. But acceptance is not the same as not wanting things. I wanted a slice of pizza from Patsy's Pizzeria on First Avenue in East Harlem. I had wanted it for 3 months, which was how long I'd been in hospice, and before that I had wanted it with the low-grade background ache of wanting something you know is there and assume you'll get around to. My father used to play piano at the jazz club across the street on Tuesday nights. After his set, we would go to Patsy's. We went every Tuesday for 11 years, from when I was 6 until he died when I was 17. I had a lot of things I would never have again. The pizza I could theoretically still get. Reuben looked at me. He could read my face. Months of proximity to a person teaches you their particular geography. He saw where I was looking. "Sam," he said. "Go to the seaport," I said. "Take everyone who'll come." "You can't." "Go." I picked up Frodo. He settled against my chest with the professional calm of a creature who has evaluated the situation and decided that my chest is still the best available option. I know what I'm doing. "That's what worries me," Reuben said. But he went. He had others to keep alive. I had myself, and even that was negotiable. I went north. The city in silence is a different city. It's not a quieter version of the same place. It's somewhere else entirely, a negative image, the the city that exists under the city's noise, suddenly exposed. I had written about silence so many times from the outside, as a literary concept, and I had never understood until that morning what it actually costs to maintain it. The effort of not making sound is enormous. Every step has to be deliberate. Every breath is a calculation. The body wants to cough, wants to shift, wants to produce the 1,000 small sounds it makes constantly without permission, and all of those sounds had to be caught and swallowed before they reached the air. I had medication in my apartment. I needed it. The pain wasn't at the level yet where I couldn't function, but it would be, and soon, and I knew what that looked like and did not want to be in the middle of a city full of apex predators when it arrived. I moved north along the east side, through blocks that were strange with their own silence. Here and there were people, pressed into doorways and alleys, watching, calculating their own routes. We didn't speak. We didn't acknowledge each other directly. Acknowledgement risked sound. Instead, we moved past each other like water around stones, keeping the distances right, understanding without words that we were operating inside a new grammar we were all inventing simultaneously. Frodo rode in my arms and said nothing. He had been a quiet cat before the world ended. He was a magnificent cat now. I was a block from my apartment building when I made a mistake. Running glass underfoot, debris from a storefront window, scattered across the sidewalk and half visible in the shadow of an awning. I didn't see it until my foot was already down. The crunch was small. The kind of small that 6 hours ago you wouldn't have registered as a sound at all. The Death Angel 4 blocks east turned its head. I froze. I had been afraid before in my life. I had been afraid in ways that had seemed very large at the time, a bad diagnosis, a parent's final weeks, the specific fear of waking up one day to find that the thing you were trying to say with your life hadn't been said. But I had never been afraid quite like that, which was a very simple and very physical fear. A large thing has heard you and is deciding whether you're worth the walk. It decided I wasn't, or it heard something louder somewhere else. It turned away. I stood on that glass for another full minute before I trusted myself to lift my foot. My apartment was on the 4th floor. The elevator was dead, the power was already flickering, and I took the stairs with one hand on the railing and my shoes in my other hand, walking in socks on the concrete, testing each step before I put my weight down. Frodo bore this with dignity. The apartment was exactly as I'd left it 6 months ago, before the hospice, which meant it had the look of a place that had been loved and then left in a hurry. Books stacked at angles, the small piano in the corner with sheet music still open, a mug I had left on the windowsill that still had a ring of dried tea at the bottom. I found the medication in the bathroom. I took what I needed. I stood at the window and looked north and counted what was left. I heard a sound below me. Not the kind that brought the creatures too small contained, a single footstep going wrong on the stairs. I waited. Another step. Careful but not careful enough, and I heard the shape of it. Someone who was frightened and was trying very hard not to show it and was failing in small increments. The knock on my door was so soft, it barely qualified as a knock at all. I opened the door. He was young, mid-20s perhaps, with the look of someone who had not slept in the past 12 hours and had spent most of those hours afraid. British, I would learn later. A law student at Columbia, on a semester abroad, in the very early stages of a panic attack that he had been suppressing with enormous and visible effort, since approximately the moment the sky opened up. He had followed the cat. Frodo had apparently found him in the flooded subway entrance 2 blocks over, and led him back the way cats occasionally do things. Not out of affection exactly, but out of some private calculus that concludes that this particular human is the correct one for this particular situation. His name was Eric. He looked at me. He looked at Frodo. He tried to say something and produced no sound, which was the right instinct even if it came from panic rather than planning. I stepped back and let him in. He sat on the floor with his back against my couch and breathed. I sat across from him and waited. Frodo walked to him, sniffed his knee, and then sat next to him with an air of professional assessment. After a while Eric wrote on the back of an envelope he pulled from his jacket pocket. My handwriting sorry, bit frozen. I wrote back how bad. He considered, moderate, working on it. I believed him. There was something in his face that was fighting hard and making progress. He was the kind of frightened that thinks its way through rather than around, which was either a useful quality or a liability depending on what the next hour required. I wrote, I need to get to Harlem. He read it, he wrote back without hesitation. Why? Not why are you going? Not shouldn't we go to the seaport, just why, as if the answer might actually be sufficient. I wrote pizza. He looked at me. There was a long pause. He wrote, is that a code word for something? I wrote, no, there's a place I want to go. There's pizza there, it matters to me. He read this twice. He looked at the window. The sounds from outside were sparse now, distant, muffled, the occasional percussion of something large moving at the edge of the neighborhood. He wrote, I'll come. I stared at him. He wrote, I'm not staying here alone, and I'm not going to the seaport without you, and I don't have anywhere else to be. I wrote, this is a bad idea. He wrote, yes, still coming. This was how I met the man who spent the last day of my life keeping me company. We went carefully. That's the only way to describe it, the same way that surgery is careful, the same way a person is careful on a ledge they didn't know they were walking until they looked down. Eric moved well, better than I expected. Law school had apparently provided him with a baseline level of physical discipline, or perhaps survival had refined it in the past few hours. He watched my signals. When I stopped, he stopped. When I went, he went. He learned quickly that Frodo had opinions about route and timing, and that these opinions were statistically better than anything the two of us could develop by unaided observation. We moved block by block. The creatures were not everywhere, but they were not predictable, and unpredictability is its own kind of everywhere. We learned them in small doses, learned that they turned their heads before they moved, that the head turn had a specific angle that meant investigating and a different angle that meant locked on, that the difference was about half a second and that half a second was enough if you were already stopped and already quiet. We learned that they had some kind of lateral line sensitivity along the plates of their bodies, something like what sharks have, that red ground vibration as well as airborne sound. So concrete was safer than metal grating, and staying off the subway grates was not optional. We found a pharmacy. This was Eric's idea. He had noticed the bottle in my hand when I came out of the bathroom at the apartment, and he had seen what kind of bottle it was. He didn't ask about it. There was no asking still. But when we passed the darkened front of a pharmacy that had been evacuated cleanly, without a fight, he pointed at it and then at the bottle and then looked at me. I shook my head. He looked at me with a specific expression that I had not yet seen on his face, and would come to recognize as his version of being absolutely certain about something, and being politely but completely immovable. We went into the pharmacy. He found what I needed with the focused intensity of a person who has assigned himself a task and treats its completion as non-negotiable. I stood watch near the door. The street outside was still. Frodo sat on the pharmacist's counter and observed the proceedings with the air of a supervisor who had decided to trust the process. When Eric found the medication, he held it up with a look of such uncomplicated triumph that I almost made a sound. I caught it, breathed through it, nodded. He put the medication in his jacket pocket, with the care of someone moving something irreplaceable. We went back out into the silence. I want to tell you something about walking through a city that has been emptied by terror. I have tried to write it since, in the way I try to write most things that matter. And I haven't found the shape for it yet. It wasn't grief, exactly, though grief was part of it. It was something more like double vision, the city I had known superimposed on the city that existed now, two transparencies laid over each other and neither quite opaque. Here was the block where I had bought groceries every Thursday morning. Here was the corner where I had stood in the rain waiting for a cab the night of my first reading. Here was the school where I had spent 3 years trying to teach 11-year-olds that words could do more than communicate information, that they could hold a shape. All of it still there, all of it different in a way that words kept sliding off of. Eric touched my sleeve. I focused, a creature 2 blocks west moving south. We waited in the shadow of a stopped bus until it passed. The bus smelled of spilled coffee and someone's lunch, ordinary smells out of time. We moved on. He asked me about my father the only way you can ask about anything in silence, which is in pieces, at rest stops, on the backs of whatever paper was in reach. We found a diner that had been left with the door ajar. The staff must have cleared out early, cleanly, taking nothing. And we sat in a booth in the back and ate crackers from behind the counter and wrote on the paper placemat and traded it back and forth, tearing off sections as we filled them. He wanted to know about the piano. He'd seen the sheet music in my apartment, the piano in the corner. That was my father's, I wrote. He left it when he moved. Then he died and I couldn't get rid of it. Did you play? Eric wrote. No, couldn't learn. He tried to teach me, but I never had the patience for the part where you're bad at it. Eric smiled at that, quiet and specific. He wrote, what was he like? I thought about how to answer. My father was a compact man who wore the same 4 sweaters on rotation and had opinions about weather systems the way other people have opinions about sports teams. He could play anything by ear. He had a laugh that started somewhere in his chest and took a long time to make it all the way out. He had died of a heart attack at 53, which was both too young and in the way of things exactly on schedule. His father had died at 54, his uncle at 51. He had known it was coming and had made his own kind of peace with it, the same peace I had been working toward since the diagnosis, though I had more warning and arguably less grace. I wrote most of this. Eric read it and wrote, he sounds like someone you'd want to know. Yeah, I wrote he was. We sat with that for a while. Outside, very distant, a helicopter crossed somewhere north of us, and we held still until the sound faded. He played at a club on Tuesday nights, I wrote, in Harlem. After the set, we'd go across the street for pizza. It was our thing, 11 years. Eric looked at this. He wrote carefully, is that where we're going? Both, I wrote. The pizzeria and the club, the pizzeria first. He folded the placemat and put it in his pocket. I noticed that and filed it away. We found the creature at the Harlem River. Not one of the ones that had been moving through the city. This was different. A convergence. 3 of them at the northern edge of the bridge, moving in the slow, deliberate way they moved when they weren't chasing anything but hadn't stopped hunting either. 3 of them at once was the most I'd seen in close proximity. They were social in some functional sense, coordinated at a distance. When one turned its head, the others reoriented by small degrees, the whole group reading the same acoustic map of the space. Eric and I were on the south side of the bridge. We had 50 feet of open ground to cross to the far side, and 3 of them between us and it. We waited 20 minutes. The creatures moved east, following something, a loose shutter on a building somewhere, caught by the wind and banging in slow, irregular rhythm. We crossed in their wake, on the side of the road where the asphalt was smoothest, Frodo in my arms and Eric half a step behind me, both of us breathing like we were rationing the air. We made it across. I leaned against the railing on the far side, and I felt the tremor in my hands that was partly adrenaline and partly the thing living in my bones that had its own schedule and didn't ask my permission. I pressed my palms flat against my thighs and breathed through it. Eric stood next to me and did not look at me looking weak, which was the only help he could offer and which was the right help. Frodo got down and walked north, and we followed him. Harlem was not destroyed. That's the thing that hit me when we turned onto First Avenue. I had prepared myself for wreckage, for the street-level apocalypse of broken windows and fire, and there was some of that, There was plenty of that, but there was also just Harlem, still there, still itself in all the ways that matter. The brownstones with their particular iron railings, the street trees that had survived 40 years of city neglect, the mural on the building on 118th that I had walked past 10,000 times without really looking at. Still there. Changed by the silence the way everything was changed by the silence, but underneath it, still itself. I found the block. The pizzeria was gone. Not destroyed in the dramatic sense, no crater, no fire damage obvious from the outside. It had simply burned, the interior blackened, the glass front blown out, the red and white sign hanging at a diagonal from one remaining bracket. It had probably been a cooking fire, something left on when the staff fled. An accident in the chaos of the first hour, nothing to do with the creatures. Just an ordinary catastrophe nested inside the larger catastrophe, because that's how the world works. I stood outside and looked at it. I had not let myself think in the hours of walking about what I would do if it was gone. The trip had a logic, and the logic required the destination, and I had not allowed the alternative to take shape in my thinking because the alternative was not useful. But now the alternative was here, materialized in front of me, a burned-out shop with my father's tradition inside it, and I did not have a next step. Eric disappeared. Not entirely. I could see him at the periphery, moving south along the block with a focused look. Frodo sat next to my foot. I watched the sign sway in the air that was moving through from the river, that slow sidewalk-level wind that Harlem always had in late afternoon, which was what it was now. Late afternoon. The light was going golden and horizontal, the light that this city does better than anywhere I've ever been. The light that picks up the brick and the ironwork and makes everything look like it was worth preserving. Eric came back with a box. Paper, grease-stained at the bottom. He held it out and his expression was completely serious, which was the right expression. Inside was a slice of pizza from wherever he'd found it, some other place, 2 blocks south maybe, some place that wasn't Patsy's but was pizza, real pizza, still almost warm. He had wrapped it in a paper towel with the care of someone wrapping something that mattered. I looked at him. He shrugged very slightly, and the shrug said, "It's not the same, but it's what there is, and I thought you should have it." I took the slice. I ate it standing on the sidewalk outside the burned shell of a place I loved, in a city that had been invaded by creatures that could kill me based on the sound of my chewing, and it was the best thing I had eaten in 6 months. Not because of what it was, because of what the effort had cost the person who found it, and what that cost said about what he thought my remaining time was worth. We went to the jazz club. It was across the street and half a block north, and it was intact. The door was unlocked. The lock had been broken from outside, probably in the first panic, someone looking for shelter who had moved on. Inside it was dark and it smelled of old wood and something that might have been machine oil from the piano's mechanisms, and the low-ceilinged intimacy of it was exactly as I remembered, which I had not expected, because memory is rarely exact. The piano was still there. I don't know why I thought it wouldn't be. It was a club piano, heavy and old and fixed to the corner of the small stage, and it had been there for 30 years and was going to outlast everything else in the room. I sat on the bench and put my hands on the keys and didn't play. I just let the geometry of the keys exist under my palms, the distance between notes, the slight give in the action. My father had sat at a piano like this every Tuesday night for 11 years, and made something happen that people paid to hear. I looked at the photographs on the wall. They had been there when I was a child, black and white prints, framed without glass. The musicians who had played this room over the decades, I found my father in 3 of them. In the first he was young, younger than I ever knew him, lean and serious, both hands on the keys. In the second he was laughing at something off camera. In the third he was looking directly at the lens with an expression I recognized, because it was the expression I apparently make when I'm thinking, which my mother used to call my writing face. a particular quality of attention, the face of someone for whom the thing in front of them is the only thing there is. I had not cried yet that day. I cried in the jazz club quietly, with my face turned away from Eric because I thought that was the right thing to do. He didn't say anything. He didn't touch my shoulder. He sat in one of the chairs near the stage and gave me the space that the moment needed and that I wouldn't have known how to ask for. Frodo jumped up onto the piano bench and leaned against my arm. I breathed. Outside, through the windows, the light was changing. The gold was going, the blue was coming in. And over that light, over the river and the rooftops, I could see the movement. Boats. Government boats, running south on the river, and behind them or ahead of them, I couldn't tell from this angle, the shapes of people on the waterfront, quiet movement in the dusk, the evacuation still proceeding. We needed to move. I took the photographs of my father off the wall. All three. They fit inside my jacket. I stood up from the piano bench and Frodo landed on the floor and looked at me with his standard expression of professional readiness. Eric was already at the door, watching the street. He looked back at me and tilted his head toward the river. We went. The waterfront was farther than it looked from the club, 3 miles, maybe a little more, back south through streets that had grown darker and more occupied in the past hour. Not occupied by people. The creatures had spread through the city with a thoroughness that suggested they didn't tire. They were in the streets and the cross streets and once, memorably, on a building face, moving across the brick with a fluidity that had no business existing on something that heavy, climbing something that should have required tools and time, doing it with the casual certainty of a creature that had never encountered a surface it couldn't navigate. We avoided them. We were getting better at it. The day had been a full course of instruction, and survival had replaced theory with practical knowledge at a pace that would have been impressive under any other circumstances. I knew the head angle that meant danger. I knew the way their bodies oriented when they had a strong signal versus a weak one. I knew that they slowed slightly before an attack, which was counterintuitive. Most predators accelerate in the final moment. And that the slow was not hesitation but precision, the system calculating the exact geometry before committing. We had 20 minutes before dark, maybe less. The boats on the river would not wait past dark. I didn't know that as fact, but I believed it as logic. We were 6 blocks from the seaport when we found the children. 2 of them in the doorway of a hardware store, pressed as far back as the door recess allowed. 7 years old, maybe 8. I'm bad at ages of children, always have been. A boy and a girl together, no adults visible, and they were alive because they had been small enough to fit in that doorway and frightened enough to stay absolutely still for however many hours it had been. We stopped. I looked at Eric, he looked at me. I reached into my jacket pocket and found the candy I had taken from the hospice, peppermints, the kind they leave in the lobby. I held them out to the children, slow and visible, and they stared at me with the specific wide focus of children who are afraid but have been afraid long enough to be thinking again. The girl took the candy. The boy held his hand out, and I put one in his palm. Eric knelt down and looked at them and then looked back at me and moved his fingers, walking, then pointing south. Come with us. The boy nodded. The girl was already standing. We went as 5. The 2 blocks before the seaport were the hardest. The creatures had massed near the water, not to stop the evacuation, I don't think, not with any strategic intent, but because sound draws them and a crowd of frightened people boarding boats is not a quiet process, even when the people are trying desperately to be. The area was crowded with creatures the way a lit lamp is crowded with moths, the same mindless orientation, the same density of purpose without intention. Eric put his hand on my arm. He pointed south along the waterfront, a route that curved away from the main concentration and came at the boats from the south side of the dock, longer but through lighter traffic. He was right. We went that way. The children moved well. I didn't know why, something in childhood maybe. the ability to take instruction from a trusted adult and execute it faithfully, without the second guessing that comes later. They followed Eric like he was a person who knew what he was doing, which was not precisely accurate but was close enough. We reached the dock. There were 2 boats remaining. The first was nearly full. I could see the silhouettes of people packed along the rails, and a figure at the stern making slow, urgent gestures toward the south loading point. The second was loading now, people moving up the gangway in the practiced silence that the survivors had developed over the course of the day. One of the creatures was at the north end of the dock, 40 feet from the gangway, facing slightly away from us, head tilted at the angle of ambient monitoring, not hunting anything specific but present and ready. We stopped at the edge of the dock. Eric looked at me. In his face was everything he wanted to say and couldn't, and what he wanted to say was that we were going to be fine, and that we just needed to be quiet and walk to the boat, and that was all it was going to take. He wanted to say it and he couldn't, and we both knew it wasn't true. 40 feet, and the dock's decking was wood over metal strapping, and there were 8 of us moving on it, 5 now. The children and me and Eric and the 3 other people who had arrived at the dock in the past few minutes, and were watching us with the particular attention of people who need a plan. I counted them, I counted the distance, I counted the creature. I thought about what I had. I had a dying woman's complete absence of investment in self-preservation. I had a yellow sweater. I thought about my father, who had played that piano every Tuesday for the love of the thing, not because it was safe or guaranteed to last. I thought about the photographs inside my jacket. I thought about Frodo, who had navigated this city with extraordinary common sense for a creature with no stake in the outcome. I thought about Eric, who had followed a cat to a stranger's door, and then followed the stranger 6 miles through an invaded city, because she wanted to eat pizza in the neighborhood where her father used to play music. I thought the things humans will do for things that don't make sense. I took my yellow sweater off. Eric saw what I was doing. He reached for my arm and I shook my head once, sharp, and he stopped, not because I outranked him, not because I'd convinced him, but because he saw my face and understood that this was not a decision, and therefore not a discussion. I gave him Frodo. Frodo permitted this transfer with the equanimity of a cat who has decided to trust the process. He settled against Eric's chest. His eyes found mine and held them for a moment, which is not the kind of thing cats do, and then he looked away, which is very much the kind of thing cats do. I wrote on Eric's palm with my finger, 1 letter at a time, because there was no paper and no time. R-U-N. He read my hand. He looked at me. I moved to the north end of the dock, 20 feet from where the creature stood, and I smashed my elbow against a car window. The sound was enormous. In 6 hours of silence, I had forgotten what sound actually was. This was sound, the implosion of safety glass, the bright crash of it, and then the alarm that the impact triggered, layered and repetitive and carrying, the specific frequency that those things had been built to carry for a block in any direction. I had not forgotten how to be loud. I had only needed a reason. The creature turned and I was already moving away from the dock, away from the boat, north along the waterfront with my arms making as much motion as I could manage, and every part of me making every sound it knew how to make. Behind me I could hear just barely. Just at the edge of what was audible over the alarm and my own breathing, the dock boards under running feet, 8 sets, moving south. The creature came after me. I had a block, maybe a little more. I was not fast, I had not been fast before the illness and I was less fast now, but I was moving, and the sound of my movement was clear and it was leading the creature away from the dock, and that was what mattered. The alarm from the car was still carrying behind me. I ran. There was a park half a block north. I knew it, had known it since childhood, the small triangle of green between the converging streets, the park benches and the old oak tree that the city had never managed to kill. I reached it and I turned. The creature was 20 feet behind me and I could see, even without eyes on its face, the perfect orientation of its sensors toward me. It had me triangulated, was operating on my precise position, was not following sound but following me. I stopped. I stood in the park by the old oak tree in the last of the evening light, and I breathed. The creature stopped too. It did that before the final movement, the calculation, the geometry. I had seen it 100 times over the course of the day, and I understood it now. I thought, this is mine. This is the kind of ending I get to choose. I closed my eyes. I heard distantly, very distantly, the sound carrying in the new silence of the city as sound carries when there's nothing to absorb it, the sound of a boat engine starting. A low, sustained note, mechanical, ordinary, the sound of something that can only go on water getting underway. The creature moved. I don't want to write what happened next as drama. It wasn't drama. It was physics, mass, and velocity, and the specific architecture of a life that had already exceeded its stated term. I know what I chose and why I chose it. I know that in the final accounting of that day, the first day, the only thing I had that the creatures couldn't model was the willingness to spend a life that was already running out on something other than my own survival. I had a note in my pocket. I'd written it in the diner, on the back of the paper placemat, while Eric was reading about my father. I had written it because I knew myself well enough to know that the situation would arrive, and I had wanted to say the words without the urgency of the moment. The note said, "Thank you for coming north. My father would have liked you." The boats reached the river. That's the thing I know. That's the fact I carry, which is all I have to carry it with. The boats reached the river and the river carried them south, and the creatures have no answer for the water, which is not a design flaw on the part of the creatures, but rather the specific crack in the armor of the world that the people on those boats squeezed through. I know because Reuben told me later, months later, when the accounting was being done, that a young British man with a cat had been one of the last ones on the second boat, and that the cat had been yellow-eyed and calm, and that the man had been very quiet, the way people are when they're holding something. I had 37 years. My doctor had guessed at 36. I am telling you this story from a place I don't entirely understand, which is what it means to be past the edge of what you planned for. The story is true. The pizza was good. The photographs of my father are somewhere I can't follow, but they were real, and he was real, and the Tuesday nights in that club on First Avenue were real, and the city that they happened in was real, and the city fought back the only way it had left, one person at a time, in small and irrational acts, in the stubborn human habit of deciding that something matters and then walking toward it regardless of the odds. The creatures came from somewhere we don't know, to take something that wasn't theirs. They found a species that goes to get pizza in the middle of an invasion. That stays when it doesn't have to stay. That writes poems about silence and then, when the silence finally comes for real, uses it like a weapon. They found us, and we found each other, and the accounting isn't done yet. My father played on Tuesday nights. We used to go after for pizza and walk home slow. That's how I want you to remember it. I have thought since about what it means that they can't swim. It's the kind of detail that should have seemed trivial, a vulnerability, yes, but a strange and specific one, the kind of weakness that belongs to a different world's taxonomy of danger. Where they came from, there may not have been water the way we have water, or the water there may have been something else entirely, something that didn't move under its own weight or reflect light the way ours does. We don't know. We know almost nothing about where they came from or what they are or how they think, if thinking is even a word that applies to them. We know that they hunt by sound. We know that they arrived without announcement, fell from the sky in the first hours of a morning when the city was fully awake and making all its usual noise, and that they began killing within minutes of landing. We know they can't swim. This is the thing that strikes me when I think about the shape of that day. We had one fact. one architectural flaw in what seemed, from the inside, like a flawless machine. One thing they couldn't do that we could. And onto that one fact, the survivors of New York City built an entire exodus, loaded boats, navigated rivers, held each other's children on unfamiliar decks in the dark, and waited for morning on the water where nothing could follow. A species that makes its decisions from one fact and improvises the rest. I don't know what that says about us. I know what it says about the day. Eric told Reuben, on the boat, that he'd met a poet, that she'd taken him north through a city full of creatures because she wanted pizza, that she'd given him her cat and her photographs and a note on a paper placemat, and then she'd run toward the thing that was going to kill her because the other option was that it killed everyone else. Reuben said, "That sounds like her." He didn't say it as a compliment, exactly. He said it the way you say something about a person when the thing you're saying is accurate, and the accuracy is the only tribute worth offering. I had written, in one of my earlier collections before the diagnosis, before the math of the remaining time became the thing I thought about in the mornings, a poem about the way sound travels, about how sound isn't a thing that moves through air so much as it's a change in air, a disturbance, the air deciding to be different for a moment. I had meant it metaphorically, in the way of poems. I had not known, when I wrote it, that I would spend a morning thinking about it practically. The creatures hear disturbance. That's all they do. They sit in the frequency of the world and they detect every place where something has decided to be different. We are always deciding to be different. That's the problem from their point of view. Every step we take, every breath, every laugh and argument and honking horn and subway scream, we are disturbance by nature, disturbance as a default state, a species that cannot move through its own world without changing the air around it constantly and completely. They came here expecting a world they could hear into silence. They didn't calculate for a species that would keep making sound even when silence was survival. Not recklessly, not stupidly, but with intention, the specific intention of a woman who had decided, in the middle of the worst day in the history of the city, that the sound she made was going to be worth something, was going to purchase something, was going to be the last poem she wrote, and she was going to write it loud. The boats were on the water when the sky went dark. Frodo sat on the rail, looking back at the city. The city was lit from below by the fires that had started in the first hours and hadn't been put out, and from above by the helicopters that were still running their grid patterns, and in between the city was dark and still in a way it had never been in recorded history. Silent. The noise that was the city's permanent condition, its identity, the thing that made it what it was, gone. But the boats were on the water, and the water carried them. And a man named Eric, who had followed a cat to a door, and then followed a dying woman to the last place she wanted to be, stood at the rail with her cat in his arms and looked at the city going dark behind him, and in his pocket was a paper placemat folded twice, and he did not read it again because he didn't need to. He already knew what it said. He would spend the next year on the water, and the year after that, doing the things that needed doing, the same as everyone else. He would learn. The way everyone learned, that survival is not a state but a practice, that the people who make it are not necessarily the strongest or the fastest, but the ones who find, in the next hour and the hour after that, a reason to keep moving that is specific enough to matter. He told me once, or rather, he told Reuben, who told me in the way that stories travel, that he thought about her on Tuesday nights, that he'd started to think of Tuesdays as a kind of marker, a way of keeping track of something he couldn't name. I think that's right. I think the dead ask for very little. A Tuesday, a window of time in a week that belongs to something other than the emergency of being alive, a small deliberate act of continuation, one person to another, across whatever distance the world has put between them. The water carries what it carries. The city would come back in time. Cities do. Not the same, nothing comes back the same, but recognizable, still itself in the essential ways, the brownstones and the street trees, and the light that goes horizontal and gold in late afternoon, and makes everything look like it was worth preserving. The musicians would play again, eventually, in rooms like the one she had gone back to find. Someone would open a pizzeria on First Avenue. Someone would sit at a piano and not play, just put their hands on the keys. These are the things we do. These are the things the creatures could not calculate for, when they fell from wherever they came from and started listening for everything worth killing. They listened for noise and found us. They should have listened for silence. They would have heard what it costs us to be quiet, what it takes, what we're willing to spend to give someone else the last 15 seconds they need. That's what they missed. That's what they're still missing. I keep thinking about Reuben. Not in a mournful way. He made it, he's fine. He's still doing the same work he was doing before, which is saying something about the man and also about the stubbornness of the work itself. But I keep thinking about the way he looked at me that morning when I said I was going north. He was a man whose professional training was entirely organized around keeping people alive, around being the person in the room who moved toward the crisis rather than away. And when I told him I was going to Harlem, he had a moment where I could see the training and the reality of me colliding in him. And then he went south, because there were 8 other people who needed south, and only one of me. That's the kind of decision that lives in a person for years. Not regret, exactly. Just knowledge. The specific weight of knowing you made the right call and that someone else paid for it. I think about Henry, too, the man we met in those first minutes when the creatures came down. I didn't know his name then, didn't learn it until later, from Reuben, from the accounting. He had been moving people toward the water from the first moment, steadily and without panic, the way a person moves who has decided what they're there for and sees no reason to revisit the decision. He made it to the boats. He made it to somewhere beyond the boats. He became, I'm told, someone important in what came after, a person who knew how to keep people alive, and had proven it on the worst day available. There were a lot of people like that. There always are. The ones who move toward rather than away. The ones who spend the first hour making sure other people know what to do and spend the second hour doing it themselves. You never see them in the aftermath. They're not the ones who get interviewed. They're just the texture of what happened, the infrastructure of survival, the people without whom the boats don't make it to the water. I was not one of those people. I was a poet with a cat and a pizza fixation and a tumor that had already beaten its own deadline. I was the person who went north when north was wrong, and who spent her last functional hours in a jazz club looking at photographs on a wall. I was not useful, in the conventional sense. I was not the kind of person who appears in the accounting on the useful side. But I think Eric made it because of me. Not in the sense that I did something operationally important. I didn't teach him anything he hadn't been figuring out himself. Didn't save him from anything that he couldn't probably have navigated on his own. I think he made it because he had something to follow. Not me as a strategy or a resource, but me as a direction, a reason to keep moving that was specific enough to be real. The pizza was real. The jazz club was real. The Tuesday nights were real, and the father was real, and the things I wanted were particular and located in the world. And particularity is what survival runs on when the larger frameworks have been removed. Abstract survival, the drive to continue, is not enough by itself. I know this from the inside, from having spent 3 months with the diagnosis before the end of the world arrived to complicate the situation. Abstract survival tells you to eat, to sleep, to take the medication, to follow the treatment protocol. It does not tell you why. The why has to come from somewhere specific. A face, a sound, a smell, a particular kind of light, a place you want to be or a thing you want to eat or a person you haven't said the right thing to yet. The creatures have no why. That's my theory, developed in the time I have had to develop theories, which is unlimited in the way of theories. They have stimulus and response, orientation and pursuit, a perfect system for converting sound into contact. They don't have a reason they're doing it. They don't have a Tuesday. We have Tuesdays. We have the thing we're going to do after this is over, even if the thing is small, even if the thing is stupid, even if the thing is pizza. We have the specific gravity of particular wants, the way a want can anchor a person to a version of the future that the present can be endured in service of. That's the thing the creatures can't hear, the frequency we operate on that their sensors aren't built for. Not the sound we make, what we're making the sound for. The water was cold on the first night. That's what Reuben said. The river was cold in the way October rivers are cold, with a specific kind of cold that gets into the joints and establishes itself. And the people on the boats pressed together for warmth the way people do when they have run out of more dignified options, and the warmth of another person is simply the fact of the situation. Eric held the cat. The cat was warm, which is the thing cats are, and the cat had no opinion about the cold or the creatures or the boats, which is also the thing cats are. He looked at the city going dark behind him, and he held the cat, and in his pocket was a folded paper placemat, and he was 26 years old, and he had spent one day in a city he didn't know in a country that wasn't his. And in that day, he had learned things about himself that he hadn't been looking to learn, and the learning had cost something he hadn't known he was carrying. He would be all right. I know this the way I know things from this side of the accounting. He is all right. He went back to his country eventually, when the boats were running again and the crossings were safer, and he finished his degree, which is the kind of detail that would have seemed absurd to predict from the dock on day one and which is exactly right. He named the cat something, I don't know what, something suitable. I imagine Frodo found the name acceptable. I imagine he looked at the name with the expression he reserved for human decisions that were within acceptable parameters, the expression that said, "This will do, I have reviewed it, you may proceed." The boats reached the water and the water carried them south, and the creatures stood at the edge of the shore, and listened to what was already out of reach, which is the thing the world had just taught them about us, that we put things out of reach, that we build boats and cross water and find each other in the dark and press together for warmth, and that the press of one warm human thing against another is not a noise the creatures can follow. It's something else. It's the sound of a species that has already decided it's not done yet. We went north that morning, Frodo and I found what I was looking for, and I gave it to someone who could carry it, and then I made myself useful in the only way left to me, and that's the whole of it. That's the story. It was enough. It was more than enough. My father played on Tuesdays, and after, we would go across the street, and the walk home was slow, and we never talked about anything in particular, and it was exactly what it needed to be. I know that now. I didn't know it then because you never know it then. You know it after. In the specific after that comes once there's no before to compare it to, in the silence that isn't threatening and isn't hunted and is just silence, the kind I used to write about, the kind that lives in the white space on the page. I understand the white space now. I think I always was writing about this, all along, in the way that you sometimes are writing about the thing you haven't gotten to yet, the thing waiting at the end of the North Road that you haven't turned onto because you're not ready or because you don't have a reason yet. I had a reason. It was pizza, and a piano, and a man named Eric who followed a cat through the end of the world because he didn't have anywhere else to be. It was enough.